Welcome back to the program and welcome to our panel this hour. I'm joined by Jannette Cotterell from Executive Council Australia and Greg Turnbull, who's a former Labor staffer and former journalist as well. Thanks both for joining us. Obviously the Boston bombings are dominating the news, shocking scenes. It's what everyone's talking about. Well, Greg, first to you, what do you make of what's happened here and the impact this is likely to have, not just in the United States, but around the world?
Well, one can't help remembering back to September 11. Of course, that was on an incredibly larger scale. But, of course, that changed the world forever. I think it was probably the biggest single world-changing event in my lifetime. And so it was quite evocative of that this morning, particularly when I heard of the news, because I remembered, if I may remember, that in 2001, Leighton Hewitt had just won the US Open, and while we were still celebrating that, September 11 happened, and of course Adam Scott wins the US Masters, and the next morning we woke up to this sort of tragedy. So a shocking event that will change the scene.
I mean, it's not on the scale of 9/11 in terms of only 3 have died so far, a number are critically injured, but a lot of people have been wounded, and a lot of people will be scared.
And of course, it's where it happened. Isn't it interesting? And I make this without a hint of criticism. But you know, I think last week I read in 2 paragraphs in the paper that 24 people died in Baghdad in yet another bombing.
Overnight, 55 died in a bombing there.
Okay, and I make no judgment. It is what it is. When it happens at the Boston Marathon finishing line, it probably has the capacity to change our world yet again.
Look, it's an interesting point. I know online people have been making this comparison. Why is the media so focused on Boston and not Iraq, where 50 people have died in a blast there? But it is unusual, and it is particularly alarming when that happens in a place like Boston. Sadly, it's become too regular in places like Baghdad.
Well, it has in Baghdad, and unfortunately I think we're getting a tin ear to those sort of events when it happens on, I guess, turf that we're more familiar with, America. And it's a very iconic event. I think everyone's either watched it, heard about it, have friends who've tried to attempt it. It's very iconic. It also, again, brings back memories of 9/11, and I think also it makes us a bit worried about ourselves. I mean, we don't know yet whether it's a homegrown attack. We don't know the implications for Australia. We don't know if this is a precursor for something bigger and larger. Just before coming on air, I was looking at images of New York flooded with heavy armed police. I mean, that's really frightening. And I think it is interesting that, for Australians, I think we would be all feeling rather insecure tonight.
Bob Carr spoke to us last hour, and look, he was fairly measured about how this is likely to play out. He didn't expect the US to tighten security laws. He said there's no need to here either. I guess it is far too early, isn't it? Until you know who's done this and how.
Whether this was just a psychopath acting alone or an organised terrorist attack, of course we don't know. But I think to pick up Jannette's point, the thing that one feels living in a Western democracy like Australia is that it could have been here. It could have been this, dare I say, the city to surf. It looks like our streets, and it looks like us.
I think it'd be interesting, actually, if there are implications in this election. I mean, there are talks about, border control. That has been a big topic for Gillard government, and she's been found wanting on that issue. Now, whether that's going to play out here, she's also been accused of cutting into defence and our security protection forces a bit too much as well, ASIO and the like. So it'll be interesting to see whether, once obviously the dust settles and more information comes forth out of this event.
Well, do you think this could feed into border security concerns?
Well, I think that's the first thing I thought about, was how it might play out down the track in this election campaign. I mean, you might remember the tragic event of 9/11 actually ended up being a 5-point bounce for John Howard. He was in America at the time, and he did have a completely different kind of issue with that event. So that might be, I don't know. I mean, we'll have to see. I think that the politicians want to be very careful not to exploit the unfortunate thing, but you never know.
It just highlights the almost impossible challenge for security, national security and domestic police security. How can, if somebody's really intending to kill innocent people at a public event, it seems they can. What could you possibly do to...
Well, particularly a marathon where you've got a 26-mile, 42-kilometre stretch to try and secure. Impossible, I would have thought. Now, let's turn to the school funding battle. Greg, do you think this is politically smart, what Julia Gillard's doing here, taking some money out of universities, putting a lot more money into schools, having a pretty big fight with some of the premiers in particular to get this through?
Look, it's a high wire act. I think people have said that it's too late in the political cycle in terms of the political benefit she could get from it. But I think that what she may well be seeking or achieve is to at least a claim, which can be debated, but a claim to the policy high ground here on education, on the NBN, and I'd throw in there the National Disability Insurance Scheme that she's proposed. The big ticket items on which I think the Labor side would say that the coalition, in respect of all of those, is offering either winding back the clock or a second best alternative. So now that might be a noble cause heading into the election. It might be a futile one, but Labor supporters would say noble all the same.
Just on the point you raised at the outset there, has the PM left this too late in the cycle, or is it a smart thing to bring this on close to the campaign and have it dominating some of the news agenda?
Well, you could ask me that on September 15 and I'll give you a comprehensive answer. But look, I think it could, with a 2 in front of their primary vote, anything's worth a try. The fact is she is committed to this. It's been a 3-year process, as I understand it, the Gonski reform proposals. And I guess the timing does mean, and given the likelihood of, or the unlikelihood of all the premiers putting up their hand and saying yes, please, it will become an election issue. And of the array of issues, I don't think it's a bad one for her.
Yeah, what do you think?
Well, I think on timing, I think a Labor MP described it today as a great juggling act. You know, the Gonski reforms, which is education, it's her bailiwick, it's her strength, and the NDIS, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, great juggling act, but the audience had left halfway through the concert, so no one's watching anyway.
So it's too late.
Too late. They've turned off. They don't care anymore. And also, once again, it's that rollout of ideas. It's a great aspirational concept, but it's been distracted with a feud among money-hungry states and which schools are going to win, which ones are losers. Why are we rewarding states that have allowed their own schools to fall into a decrepit state? Again, the optics are one that she's picking fights with all sorts of people, but not getting the message through clearly.
One of the fights that seems to be very regular now and very intense is between the federal government and WA. Why are things so sour between WA and the feds in particular? Is it the mining tax, carbon tax?
I mean, Western Australia, and I'm a proud West Australian, we've always considered ourselves a little cut above the rest of the nation. We always think we should have succeeded years ago. Yeah. There's always been a bit of them and us over there. And I think that the mining tax has gone down very badly with West Australians, the carbon tax equally so. You've got a strong Liberal Premier there who doesn't mind picking fights. It works for him to pick a fight with Labor as well. And they've got money. They don't need, Gillard to save them from anything particularly. Yeah, they're flush with cash.
It's a time-honoured tradition, isn't it? I can remember working for Paul Keating and flying to Western Australia, and Richard Court complained that he hadn't been advised that the Prime Minister was coming, causing Keating to quip, "Are you a Premier or an air traffic controller?" Premiers both in Western Australia and let's face it, Queensland have dined out for years on that sort of secessionist muttering.
Yeah. What do you think the PM will end up with, though, here? I mean, obviously, Colin Barnett is not signing up to what's on the table at the moment. He can't climb back from that position unless suddenly the deal's changed dramatically. But do you think some of the other big states will get on board? Well,
look, I mean, some of them have indicated, even Queensland have said they'll come and listen and compromise. The problem is, again, she's used that crash or crash through, my way or the highway approach, which did not work with the media laws, and I don't think it's going to work this way. I don't know why she continues to go down this sort of bullying tactic. Maybe she thinks it plays out well for her. But I was talking to a Labor MP today who's in Western Sydney, who's doing the trenches, and he says it's really hard for him to go and say that terrible O'Farrell fellow has cut $2 billion out of our school funding when the Commonwealth has just cut $2 billion out of higher education. There's a lot of mixed messages in the whole landscape of education. They've made childcare exceedingly unaffordable for a lot of average families, and they're making the other end, the university sector, extremely unaffordable for particularly disadvantaged students.
Well, I mean, I would dispute that, because I don't think that the measures that they've announced, I'm yet to see evidence or suggestion credibly that they will stop a single student from going to university in Australia. For instance, the 10% upfront discount on HECS payments, the removal of that will not stop a single Australian student from going to university.
Students who won't get scholarships now, that's going to have a big impact on them.
Instead, they'll have to repay what is a loan, which is the whole basis of the higher education contribution scheme.
Yeah.
So look, it is true that will be an additional cost.
There's an efficiency dividend as well on universities.
But they've already cut out $1 billion too, not only 6 months ago. I mean, I think the university sector is fair to be fairly cranky about this. They had no warning. It was rushed into cabinet again. No consultation. No sort of laying the groundwork, explaining why we've got a very a good education system and we can cut into it. So they're picking fights where they don't need to.
Well, it's going to be an interesting debate ahead. We're out of time, but Jannette Cotterell and Greg Turnbull, good to talk to you both. Thanks for joining us. We're going to have more on this with Tony Windsor, the independent MP, his thoughts on what the government's doing here, both with schools and universities, right after the break. For New Zealand viewers, New Zealand News is next across the Tasman. Here in Australia, stay with us. PM Agenda continues.